When you're tasked with going through something very old, perhaps it's the artifacts or boxes of a loved one who is long since not there, we will go through and find some things that we would expect that are routine, perhaps mundane, official documents and papers. And sometimes we'll find something that's surprising and that we want to investigate a bit more, maybe something we didn't know about them. And as Ken was reading chapter 7 and 8, this is some of the most difficult stuff that we have in our good book in the Bible. And I think we're meant to feel that reaction to it. If you just think this is all fine and you can absorb it no problem, then you're probably not engaging with the Bible terribly seriously. So this stuff is difficult. But what I want to give you is a sort of interpretive key that'll hopefully help you get a handle on it as we keep going through Joshua. Well, I think we've only got another 2 or 3 weeks. We're going to do half the book just now anyway. Is something I said either last week or the week before, but I'll try and keep repeating it. Is there's a lot of stuff as you're going through Joshua, an old and ancient text that is routine and absolutely consistent with any other ancient document you would find from this millennium BC. In terms of war, conquest, total obliteration, that kind of language about a people and their enemies. But uniquely, there's some stuff in here that jumps out and is not really consistent with other writings that we have in the time, particularly the singularity, the holiness, and the mercy of God and his intimate relationship with his people. And that's the stuff, I think, that we really ought to bring out and to mine for all that it's worth, which I'm going to try to do today. But since this is such a difficult story, I mean, we've come with the people of Israel led by Joshua after Moses' death, and they've come out of Egypt and been led through the wilderness, managed to cross the Jordan, and they're now got their feet on the holy ground, on the promised land. And they have so many obstacles, but so far, God has undertaken for them in all of them, and their enemies have fallen before them. And we've now come to the first time where they've been routed, where they've come to an abrupt stop, and their progress has been stopped, and they're questioning, as they always do, whether God is still with them, whether they'll continue to make progress, whether they continue to belong to God and to be his people. And we're left asking, why is that? Now, the story that Ken read for us, it turns out that there was a hidden transgression, that God had claimed the sacred items and the valuable items for himself when they were to defeat the city of Ai. And someone had taken some plunder, some loot, hidden them. It had catastrophic effects for them. They were defeated in battle. They sort it out, they go back, they win, and then they renew the covenant at the top of the mountain. And it's a kind of complete narrative that has a satisfactory conclusion. But in the midst of it, I'm sure, as it was being read, you, like me, were thinking, why did it have to be like that? And I thought today the best way to attack it would be I would try and anticipate some of the questions that you might have about these passages in this story and try and answer them, not fully or completely, but as best I can, to give you a better understanding of the text, but definitely to apply what's relevant about it. So some of the questions that I had in reading this passage and that I thought you might have were, first of all, why did God command disaster for the people? And then secondly, why did God claim things that he didn't need in terms of the treasure that they weren't supposed to take? Thirdly, why were the nations, the whole nation and the family judged as a result of that? Why did it spill out so much broader than just the one guy, Achan? And fourthly, where does that leave us? Because all of that is pretty bleak. So, let's start with number 1. Why did God command this disaster? Or let's broaden that out to a question I get asked a lot. Why does God command disaster? Why is disaster allowed to happen? And where is God when that happens? Why is he either passively or actively engaged in that kind of destruction? Now, the text actually has a really interesting answer to this, because Joshua goes up and he sends them in and he says, go and spy it out. And they come back and they say, there's going to be no problem. We are going to walk this, okay? They've got no sense of foreboding or apprehension. But what's tucked away that you and I as the reader know, that Joshua didn't know and these spies didn't know, is verse 1. The Israelites had been unfaithful. Notice he says the Israelites, not just Achan, had been unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. The things God had said, that is sacred, that is not for you, that is for me. They've been unfaithful. And so we know this hidden detail, and it's like when you're watching a TV show or the movie, and you, as the watcher, know something that the main character doesn't, and you're hiding behind the couch because you know they're walking into disaster. Okay, but they don't. That's what happens. So we know something. But then Joshua's response is, when it happens, he tears his clothes in verse 6, falls face down to the ground, and what does he say to God? Alas, sovereign Lord, why did you ever bring this people across the Jordan to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites? Because they were routed and because their success had come to a stop. The Canaanites and the other people will hear about this, and what will that do for your name? So what's he saying to God? God, you promised that you would be faithful, that you would be with us, and now look what you've done. You've turned your back, you've abandoned us, you've embarrassed us, and you've embarrassed yourself, is the sum total of what Joshua is saying to God. And you might think that's very brave and bold. But as I've said to you before, the Bible actually encourages that kind of radical honesty before God, particularly in the Psalms. Okay? So Joshua does this, and he basically says, this God, this is a you problem. This is a God-level problem. But what's he skipping over, and what does he not know that we as the audience know at this time? This was actually, in a substantial part, a human problem. He didn't know it at the time, but because of Achan's actions when they had been taking the previous city, this was starting to go against them. God had set the course in such a way, and is being true to his own nature, that said, look, these items are for me, do not take them, it's not going to go well if you do, and God follows through on that. So this has already happened, and in that sense, he's allowing the consequences to unfold, and he's giving the people who are involved in it this choice to act as one unit and to act in faithfulness or not, and they haven't. So it's a very human problem within his own ranks, which obviously unfolds, and we find that out later. But what's the implication of that for us? Because I think so often we can be inconsistent. One of the mantras of our age is definitely, I want radical autonomy. One of the great resistances to kind of faith in God and the demands of faith in God is, I don't really particularly want God or anyone or any set of books to be telling me what to do. I don't want that kind of level of involvement. I want to be quite autonomous, which a sermon for another day, but that's actually a huge burden for us to always having to be creating all the meaning for our own lives and the direction of it. But anyway, we often think that, and then when something goes wrong, and I've had this pastoral conversation so many times, well, where was God and why didn't God get involved? So quite often the picture that you get of the 21st century person is that they want to be left alone to do their own thing nearly all the time, but then they want God to swoop in and do something dramatic and miraculous when it suits them. And I hope I've painted for you just how inconsistent that is. Now, that's not exactly where Joshua was, but that principle applies to us in a slightly different way, that we want that radical autonomy, and then we go, well, God, where were you when such and such happened? And so often the things that we would ascribe to a failure to act on God's part, particularly a failure that we care about, is there are human decisions that have followed and consequences that are perhaps beyond our control. And I'm not saying they're beyond God's control. I'm just saying that sometimes the answer is a bit closer to home. And there's actually something much better than that seesawing between, I want to do my own thing and I'm not interested in what God has to say or do to, actually I want God to intervene. The picture the Bible gives is not those extremes. It's what you can actually exist in is this sort of covenant, this bond, this relationship of faithfulness, where God is generous and consistent to you. And no doesn't jump in and change every circumstance that you would like him to in your life, and doesn't even promise to remove all suffering, but does promise to be with you and to give you that assurance and to be faithful to you. And so then we're often given the clarity to be able to see that wasn't actually a God problem or a failure on God's part. That was an eminently human problem. And that's often the situation that we find ourselves. Our world is filled with human problems. And the texts of the scriptures often give us the freedom to be, and the maturity to be able to see that and to make our way forward based on that. So why does God create this disaster? In a large part, God didn't, because this was a human disaster. But then why did God, and I think this is in some ways the most difficult one, I spent the most time on this one, why did God claim things that he really didn't need? Because in the opening verse, it says, the Israelites were unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. Now in the Hebrew, that was the herem, the stuff that was supposed to be set apart for God only. And in the previous chapters that we were going through, it was the silverware, the precious items, the really kind of top tier stuff. And it was to be the loot that you would get in any war. And it was to be devoted and set apart for God and brought into the sort of the Lord's treasury and not taken by the people. And my immediate question with this, and I don't know if it was yours, was why? Why did God want that stuff? What does a supernatural, a deity, omniscient, omnipotent God, what does he need with that stuff? There are other, and I'm getting this from the scriptures, because there are other parts of the Bible that tell us that God is the creator and the maker of heaven and earth, that he has need of nothing, that he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. It's a saying we're fond of bringing out to show that God can provide anything at any time. So what does he need with this silverware? And it's a bit like, for me, this is my interpretation. I never actually saw this in any commentary, so this might be really off. But this is the best I can do with this question. Very often when God is interacting with a person in the Bible and he asks a question, we know that God is all-knowing, and so it's never for his benefit that he's asking. It is to engage with the person and to get them to think. And I think a similar thing is going on here. I don't think God asks for the devoted things for his benefit so that he will become a bit richer, or when he's with the other gods, that he gets to show off that he has all this silverware. It's really not like that. I think it's for the people's benefit. And let me explain to you what I mean. I'm getting some of this from the text, because we read that when Achan kind of fesses up, that he uses this really key language. Achan replied, I've sinned against the Lord, the God of Israel. In verse 21, I saw this beautiful robe from Babylonia, which would have been a really prized item at the time, 200 shekels of silver and a bar of gold, and I coveted them and took them. Now, here's the language. I saw the plunder of a beautiful robe. That verse for saw is the exact same verb that we read right at the opening of Genesis, when Eve saw the fruit of the garden and that it was good and that it was pleasant to the eyes and it would be good for taste. Okay? Saw and reaching. And then he says in his own words, I coveted them, which is the same language that's used for the 10th commandment in Deuteronomy, for coveting what one should not have but will take because it's pleasant to them. God doesn't put those things out of reach because he needs them. He puts those out of reach because the people need to learn to live without them, or certainly without the obsession and the draw towards them. Because this has been endemic in the human condition ever since we did reach for the fruit that was good and pleasing to the eye. A lot of humanity and the problems you and I face in the world would be infinitely better if people knew how to overcome that draw to what looks pleasing to the eye, or what has got a hook around their heart and pulls them to want either what is not theirs or what they just want more of and cannot get enough of. Can you see when I put it like that, that that's a problem that's everywhere, that has touched maybe us or people that we love? And in God's infinite wisdom, he actually wants to get his people to start their life in a way that doesn't have a grip on their hearts. That to me is the most sane and salient explanation of why God has said, this stuff is for me. Because God's not going to get obsessed with more silverware. He is God. He owns everything. But there's a very real chance that the people will. And that they will create an affection and an affinity for all those material things that'll harm them, that'll harm those around them, that they will steal, kill, and destroy in order to get more of, and that'll ultimately harm their connection to God, because they will look for satisfaction in those things rather than in the fact that they are in a bond and relationship with the God of heaven. Now, to what degree is that everywhere in our world? Who of us doesn't struggle with being connected to something and wanting more of something to the point where it harms those around us? And it also, if we're Christians, it can even harm our connection to God, because we think, I'll be satisfied if I can achieve this status in life or gain this thing or move towards something else. And it ultimately will turn around and we go, it's a long time since I really felt like I was terribly connected to God, because the stuff of our world has encroached in our hearts. Jesus talks about it when he talks about the parable of the sower, and he talks about one of them, and the thorns and thistles come and choke out the good seed. It's the cares of the stuff of this life, of just thinking. And, the Bible, we're looking at some old texts, and some of it is, we think, my goodness, that's barbaric and old. And then we look at other parts of it, particularly that parable Jesus tells, and that's 2,000 years old. And my goodness, did he see the 21st century coming, where you and I would exist in an ecosystem that is continually throwing stuff in our faces and saying, if you can just buy a wee bit more of it, then you'll finally be settled and happy. And it calls us away from that kind of idolatry, because one of the consistent themes in the Bible is if you give in to idolatry, it will choke out your heart and it will begin to take over your life, and it'll dull and numb your sensibilities, particularly your spirituality. So why does God ask for stuff that he doesn't need? Precisely because he doesn't need it, and he knows that we need to be detached from the stuff. But then why are the nation and the family and everyone else judged as part of it? Now, this is, spoiler, this is one I don't exactly have a one-to-one answer to. We're too far removed from the text. I would be claiming a wisdom I don't have to say I know exactly why, but I can draw some allusions and relevant implications from it. Because as we read it, it's catastrophic. The nations already had a rout, and people have died in battle as a result of it. And they took Achan and the silver and the robe and the gold bar and the stuff that he coveted, the animals and his family, and they're stoned and then they're burned, and the memory of them is wiped out. And in some ways that is the judgment. In the ancient world, the worst judgment was you and your lineage are going to come off the face of the earth, and no one's really going to remember you. You're not going to have any fame or even infamy. Why? Well, this is a hard one, but perhaps it's a hard pill to swallow. But I think in some sense, one of the lessons that gets distilled and brought to the top is that a transgression is rarely ever individual or completely private. And this is where it's a correction to our world, because our world, again, is high on individuality and individualism. and tries to get us to believe that if you do you and I do me, then that's going to be absolutely fine. And it's not going to have any consequences beyond you personally. And that's true for some things, but in lots and lots and lots of ways that isn't true, because none of us live in a silo or as an island. And our decisions and the way we walk and put one foot in front of the other does affect the people around us, either locally or even sometimes nationally, depending on who we are. The first thing I want to deal with there is that the way God speaks about it is that this isn't perhaps as slam dunk as we think it is. Because he says this is what happened. Israel has sinned. They've violated my covenant, which I commanded them to keep. They've taken some of the devoted things, they've stolen, and then they've lied, and they've put them with their own possessions. Now, what I read from that as I was studying this week is that there was actually opportunities to correct this. And just a very quick lesson is always take the opportunity to correct a mistake. Because if Achan has lied, and perhaps his whole family has lied to help him kind of cover it, is that they've had an opportunity to go, let's just deal with this, kind of unceremoniously. And he's not, and he's doubled down, and doubling down is always the worst. There's nothing worse than, when you're watching a politician in an interview, and rather than just say, yeah, you know what, that was a bit of a mistake, they try and act as if they're godlike in their vision and in everything that they foresaw, and it's just so embarrassing. And then they resign a week later anyway. But it's a lesson that we don't seem to learn. Is just take the opportunity to take the high road, take one on the chin, and move on. And I think the text is trying to show God probably did give that opportunity, and it didn't happen. But nevertheless, then, it ends up affecting so many people. Let me try and illustrate this for you. Many of you will have in your minds, you probably saw it on the news at the time, the Chernobyl disaster. I was about 3 months old, so I don't remember it. But it was 1986, and the nuclear power plant, they were trying a fairly routine test on what would happen in the event of a power outage. And it went catastrophically wrong. The cooling systems failed, overheated, and the core reactor blew. And we know the rest is history. 50,000 odd people in that town had to evacuate because of the radiation. But the problem that day, or even in that system and in that culture, was not that there was bad engineering and a faulty reactor, because that could have been overcome and that could have been dealt with. The problem was, if you watch the drama that was done, it's excellent. You can see that there's an overbearing boss who says, I don't care that there's safety concerns here, let's do it, because I want to look good to my higher-ups that we've pulled this off on time. The problem was, when you look into the reports and the investigations, that in 1984, 2 years before, 4 similar incidents and failures had been reported and discovered. But in the Soviet Union, there was such a culture of trying to present this perfect front to the rest of the world to compete, that they never allowed for the possibility of failure and of questioning and of self-reflection. And it had enormous consequences in terms of death. It was so responsible because the initial signal was picked up in Sweden by a nuclear worker there that started picking up strong radiation signals. Who knows, if the wind had been going a different way, how it could have spilled out and caused even more consequences for people even further away. Mistakes, and particularly doubling down, lying, and admitting no fault, has disastrous consequences for ourselves, and then for often the people around us, and then for often people even several circles beyond that. And I think that's a principle we find in this story. What the scripture celebrates is what you find in Psalm 32. Blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven. And the psalmist in that says that when I hid my sin, my bones melted like wax and I faded away. But when I confessed my sin to the Lord, I found healing. There's something so powerful and so healing about admitting that we have been wrong, that we've got it wrong, and we move forward from there. And there's something so corrosive and destructive. Who is the hardest person any of you have ever had to deal with? It's the person that can never admit that they're at fault, ever. Impossible. And they'll destroy families because nobody can deal with them. They'll split off relationships. There is nothing as destructive to our society. And then when we get a culture of it in governments, it means that enormous things are missed and pushed over and pushed past. And then the other side of that is that we're called to be a people of mercy. And so that's why it's important for us to be, as Christians, merciful, not just because Jesus told us to, but because it encourages the cycle of healing and repair and dealing with things. But it's so important to, when we realize it, to look for that and to stop the cycle of doubling down and of covering and just to go, it was wrong, but we get to realize who we are then. We're sinners who make mistakes, but with God, His mercies are new every morning. And that brings me just to the end. What hope do we have if that's the case? Because a lot of this stuff is hard and heavy and bleak, and I just didn't want to shy away from the challenge of these passages. But I think there is hope, because at the very end, Ken read for us that the covenant was renewed at Mount Ebal, and Joshua read to the whole assembly of Israel, all the women, the children, the foreigners, those who lived among them, the words that Moses has written, which was the record of how God had bound Himself in relationship to them. And here is the hope. The point of all of that is meant to lead to what they experienced, which was covenant renewal for all people. It was God renewing His promises to be with and to be faithful to His people. And we have to look at this as Christians from the New Testament perspective, because things have moved on and changed a lot, and we do get movement in the way things happen. The gospel ultimately comes to remove the pollution and the sediment and the blockages that stand between us and God. The natural impurities, our tendency to want to hide and cover up and get away from our mistakes, or even our doubling down and our determination to make mistakes and to do it with impunity. The gospel makes it possible that all of that can be dealt with because Christ pours out His own blood rather than see anyone else pay for any of that. Christ pours out His own blood to show people, actually, this is what God is truly like. This is how devoted He is to you. He will send and sacrifice His own Son to show you that this covenant that the people experienced here, He wants to make sure that it's bonded forever in eternity. And then what I hope, because sometimes if we have a tender conscience, this can be hard stuff. So if you're the kind of person who tends to be the other way, and you absolutely self-flagellate yourself over mistakes and where you've been in your past and what you've done, then I think it's important to record the testimony of John, where he says, if we confess our sins, God Himself, not anyone that we need in the middle, not a huge public display like they had in Israel, God Himself, in the secrecy and the quietness of your heart, is faithful and just to forgive us our sins. Faithful because He never goes back on what He's promised to do, which is to offer forgiveness to all who ask. Just because God has so now staked His reputation on the fact that He is a merciful God who will overflow with His love and forgiveness to all who ask, that it would be an injustice for Him to withhold that. And so, if that's you, then be reassured this morning that God Himself has said that it would be an injustice for Him to hold back the forgiveness that you want and that you long for. And so, these texts, they give us all sorts of really difficult questions. And some of them are not answerable. But a lot of them trace a line all the way through humanity, from the time they were written to today, the problems we face, the doubling down, the lack of regard for those around us and the consequences of what we might do. But ultimately, they end up at the gospel of God being so determined to keep doing what he did with Joshua and the people, of meeting the people in this bond and this promise of his faithfulness, so that they can keep knowing that they are the people of God and that even their worst days can be dealt with, so that they are able to proclaim his love and faithfulness to more people. May God bless its word to us this morning. Amen.